In the harsh winter of 1851, beneath a gray sky that seemed to press upon the rooftops of Richmond like an ancestral curse, two identical men passed through the gates of the esteemed Virginia Medical College. They were young, elegant in posture, dressed in dark wool coats that contrasted with the pallor of their faces, and carried with them a dense silence that seemed to swallow the sound of their own footsteps. Thomas and Elias Henderson, twins. Perfect in symmetry, indistinguishable even to the most observant. But they came not as doctors nor as students. They sought treatment, a kind of help that was not physical but mental. They described their condition as a shadow dividing them from within, a fractured mirror in their consciousness. What no one knew at that moment was that, within 6 months, both bodies would lie stretched over cold slabs, one with eyes dilated by madness, the other with a soul emptied into mortal apathy. And what would lie hidden behind their deaths would not be diagnosed by any medical manual, but buried beneath layers of silence, codes, lies, and blood. During their first days at the college, Thomas and Elias were placed in opposite wings, a preventive measure recommended by the attending physician, a respected yet enigmatic man named Dr. Cornelius Hartwell. This man, with graying temples and a serene voice, was known for his radical ideas on mental disorders and the icy gleam in his eyes whenever he spoke of behavioral observation. According to him, the brothers needed isolation to prevent their symptoms from feeding off one another. The theory seemed plausible. But to some, the eagerness with which he imposed their separation sounded more like desire than diagnosis. Thomas, the elder by mere minutes, had a temperament like a drawn blade, explosive but restrained, always with fists clenched beneath the table and words laced with cutting irony. Elias, on the other hand, was the silence that observes, the void between screams. His passivity was so thick it became unsettling. One would be reduced to animal instinct, the other dissolved into the most absolute absence of identity. But that was yet to come. For now, the experiment still wore the disguise of treatment. The story of the Henderson twins, however, did not begin there, among stone corridors and chemical formulas. Its roots ran deep into the fertile and tainted soil of a massive tobacco plantation 19 kilometers away, near the edges of Henryville County. An 800-acre property that looked like a slice of paradise on earth, but concealed hell beneath its roots. The land was so fertile, locals used to say that if you stuck a dry twig in the ground it would bloom. But it wasn't the soil that grew so easily, it was flesh. Bodies weren't buried there. They were hidden. The family patriarch, Bartholomew Henderson, had built his fortune not only through tobacco leaves but through the invisible and bloody trade of so-called anatomical artifacts. Corpses, skeletons, living bodies, alive. Sold to medical schools for a price that varied according to physical integrity and degree of preservation. It was a silent, profitable, and rotten business to its core. And his sons, Thomas and Elias, were raised amid it all as if it were perfectly natural. While other children played hide and seek, they learned to measure how long it took for a human being to drown in formaldehyde. Since childhood, the brothers' behavior had been studied as a mirrored reflection of two dark halves of the same soul. Thomas was the lash, Elias the ghost. One would tear the wings off dragonflies just to see what remained of flight. The other would watch, still-eyed, never intervening. The household servants, all enslaved, feared both, but Elias frightened them more. Because he didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He just watched. And there was something in his eyes that made even the oldest men tremble inside. As if he knew too much. As if he remembered something the world tried desperately to forget. By 15, both were already involved in the family business, helping their father embalm bodies, forge death certificates, and inject experimental compounds into those condemned to oblivion. By 25 now grown men, the twins began to display strange symptoms. Not just imbalance, but dissonance. Thomas began attacking animals for no reason. Elias would fast for days, claiming to hear voices inside the walls. Their father, though long accustomed to the macabre, grew concerned when the servants began to disappear. Always at night. Always with some excuse. Escape, illness, trade. But there was too much blood, and too many muffled screams, for it to be coincidence. Then, one frozen February morning, Elias appeared on the mansion's front porch, naked, covered in scratches, and with hands stained with something the servants knew was not dirt. He held a shovel, and repeated in a neutral tone, "They are walking. The specimens are walking." Thomas, once the most ruthless, turned pale as lime. And when he went to the barn, he found the bodies of 3 enslaved people arranged in a scene of ritualistic horror. The corpses were seated around a table as if partaking in a dinner, eyes propped open with twigs. each with their hands spread upon the table as if they were debating something. The brutality of the wounds was grotesque, but the coldness of the staging was even worse. And what disturbed Thomas most wasn't the crime, was the déjà vu. As if he had imagined this very scene deep within his unconscious. It was in that moment something broke between the brothers. Not the fraternal bond, but the thin line that separates insanity from lucidity. Dr. Hartwell heard of the case through medical rumors. And when he saw the clinical state of the two brothers, his reaction wasn't compassion, but opportunity. He believed, and publicly defended, that the human psyche could be redesigned through chemical manipulation, and that identical twins represented the highest standard of experimental control. His proposal to the Henderson family was subtly perverse. Admit both sons, isolate them, administer specific substances and document everything. One would become the predator, the other the prey. And according to him, the experiment would reveal secrets about the human mind capable of redefining modern medicine. Bartholomew, desperate, agreed. And thus, under promises of healing, the twins were delivered to hell. The accommodations were luxurious, but what occurred behind closed doors was torture disguised as science. Thomas began receiving compounds that inflamed violent impulses. Elias sedated until he lost all will. Within weeks, their faces remained identical, but their eyes inhabited different universes. One became the beast, the other the husk. And Dr. Hartwell, the maestro of this orchestra of suffering, recorded it all. In ciphered notebooks. With surgical precision. His records would later be discovered hidden in secret compartments of the college library, written in codes so complex it would take years to decipher them. And when they finally were, the truth they revealed was darker than any diagnosis ever written on paper. But before we can move forward into the consequences, we must descend deeper into the origin of the darkness. Because what happened to the Henderson brothers was not a medical accident. It was a sentence, handed down by a system that believed certain human beings could be dismantled and rebuilt, as if the soul were an experiment, and pain a variable. This is the story medicine tried to bury. But the dead, they say, have a nasty habit of digging silently. The second act of this story doesn't begin with a scream, but with a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the very walls of the East Wing of the Virginia College of Medicine. After the arrival of the Henderson twins, the once lively hallways, filled with the shuffle of students and muffled conversations, began to carry an eerie reverence. There was something in that wing, a kind of invisible vibration, a pressure in the air, as if the building itself had started breathing more slowly. Hartwell, now in full command of the treatment, arranged every detail with terrifying precision. Rooms 312 and 314, where Thomas and Elias were housed, were reinforced with double locks, sealed windows and embedded observation systems that allowed constant monitoring. Between them, Office 313, where the doctor recorded everything. And when I say everything, I mean every involuntary tremor, every fluctuation in heartbeat, every incoherent sentence uttered during induced episodes. The line between patient and test subject had vanished, replaced by a clinical coldness that turned human suffering into raw data. The effects of the initial treatments appeared quickly. Thomas, whose temperament had always flirted with the abyss, began to display a kind of rage that defied medical understanding. He didn't merely explode in violence. He composed fury as if writing a symphony. He destroyed furniture, shredded bedsheets with his fingernails until they bled, but did it methodically, with precision, with intent. His words, when they emerged between outbursts, were cold and calculated. They want to know how far I'll go, and I'll show them. It was as if he knew on some level that he was being pushed, molded, and accepted the role with a perverse willingness, like someone staring into a cracked mirror and choosing the most monstrous reflection. Elias, on the other hand, sank deeper into an ocean of silence. He stopped answering questions, stopped eating on his own, stopped blinking regularly. He spent hours in static positions, eyes fixed on invisible points. When he did move, it was as if someone else was in control, a human echo, obedient to commands no one else could hear. What few people knew, and those who did chose to ignore, was that Hartwell had already been denounced for similar practices in the past. In Philadelphia, where he began his career, 3 patients with mental disorders had died under his care. The investigations were inconclusive, the reports inconsistent, the documents mysteriously vanished. And yet, here he was in Virginia with full authority to conduct what he described as the most advanced research on the degeneration and regeneration of the human mind in twin organisms. He wrote like a prophet of science, using phrases like ego reconstruction and emotional reformatting. But behind the scenes, What was truly happening was closer to emotional vivisection. Thomas and Elias were not being treated. They were being peeled back, layer by layer, until nothing remained but what Hartwell wanted to observe: pure, primitive instinct stripped of morality and identity. The nightmare deepened when testing began with substances Hartwell received from correspondents in Europe. Uncatalogued compounds, many of them derived from opium, belladonna, mercury, and other substances whose use was at best experimental, at worst criminal. Thomas began exhibiting signs of extreme neurological excitation: erratic heartbeats, abnormal strength, delirious episodes in which he spoke in multiple voices, as if his mind had fractured and created new inhabitants. A nurse privately reported that Thomas described in detail how to dismantle a human body with surgical precision, without ever having formally studied anatomy. Worse, while speaking he smiled, as if sharing an intimate secret. Elias, in contrast, entered a near-vegetative state. He did not respond to external stimuli. He didn't recognize names. He didn't know who he was. And one day, when asked who he saw in the mirror, he replied, "I see what's left. It's not me. It's what's left of what they wanted me to be." The faculty began to grow uneasy. Senior doctors started to quietly question Hartwell's methods. But there was no evidence. No reliable records. Because every document, absolutely every one, was being archived using a private code, a language invented by the doctor himself to ensure only he could understand what was being recorded. Even nurses had to report using technical terms they often didn't comprehend. The dean of the college, pressured by the growing reputation of the institution and the sizable financial support of the Henderson family, chose the easier path, to look the other way. But the building, as I said before, breathed. And the walls began to whisper. Voices. Nocturnal noises. Cracks from the third floor when no one should have been there. A janitor reported seeing Thomas walking naked down the hallway at 3 in the morning, despite his door being locked. When he confronted the figure, it vanished. Another staff member swore he heard whispers coming from Elias's room, even though the boy had been unconscious for 2 days. Later, it was discovered that the window glass had been scratched from the inside, forming illegible words, except for one: mirrors. This was no longer medicine. It was an experiment that had crossed the boundaries of the human. And no one, absolutely no one, knew how to stop it. And then came the disappearance. On the night of October 12th, Elias vanished. His door was found slightly ajar, the bed untouched, personal belongings in place. No sign of escape. No witnesses. No noise. Just emptiness. Hartwell declared that the young man had suddenly regained consciousness and fled toward the plantation, missing his home. But no one believed it. How could a man in a near-vegetative state, with zero autonomy, disappear without help? The search was intense but fruitless. And then, 3 days later, a janitor detected a putrid smell coming from the specimen room in the basement, a place rarely accessed. When the door was forced open, Elias's body was there. Cold, arranged. His eyes pried open with metal clamps, as if still observing. What the medical examiners found caused nausea. The brain had been removed with surgical precision, through an opening at the back of the skull. No signs of violence, no damage to other organs. A clean dissection. A procedure carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hartwell claimed it had been an attempted autopsy, initiated after a sudden death from seizure. But the notes were false. The nurses knew it. The other doctors knew it. And Hartwell vanished. 3 days after Thomas's death, which followed his brothers in a suffering so absurd that medicine had no name for it. He died screaming, or laughing, or both at once. His last words, spoken to Nurse Wickham, were, "Tell them, we were people, before they turned us into specimens." The revelation of Elias's death cast a permanent shadow over the college. Even those who had remained neutral could no longer sustain their silence. Nurse Margaret Wickham, once reserved and composed, began writing down what she had witnessed in a diary hidden beneath the floorboards of her dormitory room. There she recorded dates, names, substances, reactions, and above all, the horrors her eyes had been forced to witness. She described, with an almost mechanical coldness, the muffled screams from Office 313, the time she saw Hartwell inject substances that made Thomas's skin twitch as if touched by living electricity. She wrote about Elias crying without sound, tears trailing down empty eyes as he was held in states of induced paralysis. But what drove her to the brink was a scene she witnessed through a half-open door. Thomas, strapped to the restraint chair, being forced to watch his brother's treatment session. His expression was not one of rage, it was fascination. As if some part of him, perhaps the only part that still felt, fed off what he saw. That, according to Margaret, was not science. It was sadism on an industrial scale. And still, the college administration hesitated. Hartwell's reputation had grown in the shadows. His scientific reports were about to be published in obscure European journals specializing in unconventional studies. If the truth came to light, it wouldn't just be a reputation that collapsed, it would be the entire structure of Southern medicine. The college couldn't admit it had allowed two young men to be reduced to objects. Even less that all of it had been funded by one of the most influential families in the region. So they chose the oldest path in the world: cover up. They invented an official version, prepared forged death certificates, sealed the records with administrative stamps, and spread the story that the Henderson brothers suffered from an incurable, hereditary degenerative disease that led to simultaneous terminal episodes. But the problem with silence is that it's never absolute. It pulses, it vibrates, and over time it rots from within. In the case of the Virginia College of Medicine, the silence began to crumble through whispers, then anonymous letters. One staff member, weighed down by guilt, sent a torn-out page from Hartwell's journal, written in code, to the editorial office of a local newspaper. The content in itself was incomprehensible. But the frantic handwriting, the symbols, the grotesque graphs drawn in the margins, it was enough to disturb. The newspaper didn't publish it, but they archived it. And years later, that fragment would be found by a determined researcher named Sarah Collins, who would dedicate 15 years of her life to reconstructing the story that medicine had tried to bury. And it was she who made the connection that many feared to even consider. The Henderson brothers were not the only ones. At the back of Hartwell's locked cabinet, discovered months after his disappearance, there was a box with names, dates, and locations. Most were scribbled in haste, as if written while on the run. Among them were the names of other medical institutions across the southern United States, with codes suggesting more experiments, with doubles, twins, orphans, and asylum patients. The modus operandi was the same: isolation, chemical manipulation, encrypted documentation. Sarah was able to identify 3 similar cases, in New Orleans, Mobile, and Savannah. All involved twins. All ended in inexplicable deaths. All involved men who used pseudonyms but, upon deeper investigation, shared traits with Hartwell: thin build, piercing eyes, controlled speech, and no traceable past. But returning to 1851, there's one detail that cannot be ignored. On the day of Thomas's death, after 6 hours of feverish delirium and convulsions, a message was found written in blood on the wall of his room. Not ink. His own blood. The sentence was short, trembling, and appeared to have been made with his fingers. Read: "Specimens don't feel pain. But we do." The medical staff tried to erase the message. They painted over it. But for weeks, the words kept emerging beneath the paint, as if the blood refused to be silenced. Eventually, room 312 was sealed. And room 314 too. They claimed it was for renovations. Then that there was structural risk. Finally, they said the wing would be converted into a storage area. And so it remained. Decades passed. The Civil War came and went. The world changed. But the whispers about the twins never fully stopped. Medical students reported hearing footsteps during the night. Doors slamming on their own. Muffled moans. And, the most disturbing of all, 2 identical shadows walking the hallways. One of them whispered. The other laughed. There was a rumor in Richmond, one of those that begins as a breeze and turns into a hurricane in the forgotten corners of empty hallways, that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell had never actually left. Even after his supposed escape to Philadelphia, even with the files sealed and the name Henderson buried beneath layers of institutional silence, even after the ink on the death certificates had dried, it was said that, at night, when the students had closed their books and the janitors locked the doors of the Egyptian building, a man still walked the corridors of the 3rd floor. Tall, thin, wearing gloves with steel blue eyes like cooled iron. But it wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was something worse, a presence that had never ceased to exist, a living consciousness lodged between the cracks of time, as if the very madness he cultivated had found fertile soil and taken root in the foundations of the building. And maybe that wasn't even a metaphor. Maybe horror, once planted, can't be uprooted. Because some seeds don't die. They just wait. The months following the death of the Henderson brothers were marked by a quiet paranoia within the college. The administration tried to restore a semblance of normalcy, but it was like polishing a cracked mirror. No matter how much it shone, the reflection remained distorted. Several professors requested leave. Nurses disappeared from the night shifts. The janitor who found Elias's body, Samuel Potts, never returned to work. And among those who remained there was only one rule: no one spoke of the case. Ever. It had been officially classified as a familial psychotic collapse with neurological complications. A phrase that sounded scientific but said absolutely nothing. And yet, said everything. Time, as always, tried to bury the truth beneath the dust of records and the routine of new academic years. But what no one anticipated was that, on the other side of the Henderson plantation, someone else remembered. An old man, hunched by age and by the weight of what he had witnessed. His name was Ezra, and for 3 decades he had been enslaved on that cursed land. He was the last person to see Thomas and Elias alive before they were taken to Richmond. And more importantly, he was the one who saw them grow up. Who cleaned the blood from the barns. Who heard the muffled screams in the dead of night. Who found a strange amulet buried beneath the magnolia tree behind the main house, with both their names carved into it using what looked like a human fingernail. Ezra never spoke of it. Until Sarah Collins, decades later, found him in a nursing home in Petersburg. Alone, blind, his mind oscillating between delirium and lucidity. She was tracing clues, small, almost invisible ones, that connected the Henderson plantation to other cases being quietly suppressed throughout the American South. And the name Ezra had appeared scribbled in the margins of a letter written by none other than Jeremiah Henderson himself, recovered from the archives of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. It was a minor detail. But in this kind of story, details are the stones that pave the way to hell. Ezra didn't speak at first. On the first visit he mumbled nonsense. About candles lit at midnight. About eyes that didn't blink even after death. About the man with gloves, who drew circles on the floor with red chalk. But on the third visit, when Sarah brought a restored photo of the plantation, he touched the image with his worn fingers and said, with absolute clarity, "They were never two. They were always one, split in half." And then he spoke. He told her about the night of the storm when the twins were born. About the thunder that silenced the dogs. About the mansion clock that stopped at 3:06 a.m. and never ticked again. About how Thomas cried as if he had seen the end of himself, and Elias didn't cry. He just looked at the midwife, as if he knew her. Ezra spoke of the lessons Jeremiah gave his sons. How he taught them to cut without leaving marks. How he used rabbits to teach that eyes still move, even after death. How he made the boys repeat phrases like, "Pain is not weakness. Pain is data." And how, at 12 years old, Thomas held a knife for the first time, and didn't flinch. But it was Elias who disturbed him most. Because he never spoke, never refused, and never blinked. He wasn't evil, Ezra said. But he wasn't good either. He was the other side of the same blade. Sarah recorded everything. Every word. And compared it to the few documents that remained, those that had escaped the seal of institutional censorship. Dates matched. Names repeated. Substances Ezra mentioned appeared in encrypted letters attributed to Hartwell. And then came the most disturbing discovery, a notebook. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the old Henderson mansion, now converted into a rural museum. Found by a restorer who stepped through a loose plank. The notebook was bound in dark leather, untitled. Only the initials "sit" embossed on the cover. Inside, notes, graphs, and what appeared to be detailed transcripts of behavioral reactions, not just from the twins but from other subjects. Children. Inmates. Always in pairs. Always testing what Hartwell called the mirror connection. And among the notes, a passage violently crossed out but still legible. If we can split a being into two behavioral extremes, we can understand the breaking point of the human soul. Thomas and Elias are the ideal model. One bends to the predator, the other to the void. If they survive, the world will change. If not, at least we will have learned enough to try again. Enough to try again. That phrase was not just a conclusion. It was a promise. And perhaps, just perhaps, a warning. Hartwell's journal, found beneath the floorboards of the old Henderson mansion, was not merely a medical record. It was an altar. Each page exuded a kind of devotion rarely seen in scientific reports. Words drawn with obsession, lines oscillating between chemical formulas and ritualistic verses. As Sarah Collins studied the pages, she realized she wasn't facing just a doctor with radical ideas. She was facing a man who viewed medicine as priesthood, and human suffering as sacrament. The journal was divided into 3 sections: separation, domination, and fusion. The first dealt with the initial stages of induced dissociation, chemical and sensory methods used to destabilize identity. The second detailed techniques for amplifying extreme behaviors through environmental stimuli, sleep manipulation, and forced ingestion of compounds. But it was the third section that made Sarah step back from the desk, her skin suddenly cold. Fusion spoke of an experiment that appeared in no official report. A procedure conducted in the college basement, where Hartwell believed he had succeeded in triggering the simultaneous manifestation of two consciousnesses, or two wills, inside a single body. He described sessions in which Thomas spoke with Elias's voice, and moments where Elias looked at others with Thomas's characteristic hatred. According to Hartwell, the mirror doesn't just reflect, it transmutes. When pushed to its limit, identity can dissolve and be reborn in another vessel. The words were written with euphoria, almost delirium. Hartwell believed he had opened a door, not just in the twins' minds but between realities of personality. His obsession wasn't with healing, nor with science. It was with absolute control over human nature. As if he could play God, split good and evil between two bodies, and then fuse them again. Sarah cross-referenced the journal with hidden records from the college. She discovered that shortly before Hartwell's disappearance, a fire had broken out in the basement laboratory, officially caused by a chemical equipment malfunction. But staff reports hinted at something else. An overwhelming metallic stench, and screams that didn't sound human. One janitor, in a letter to his wife, wrote that he saw something come out of the pale boy's body, like smoke but with eyes. The letter was confiscated and never published. But the family kept it. And when the granddaughter learned about Sarah's investigation, she handed over the document. The description matched a passage in Hartwell's journal, one where he described the moment of Elias's total disintegration as the birth of a new specular subject. No one knew what it meant, but everyone knew. It wasn't good. Meanwhile, the college struggled to contain the growing curiosity. Bolder students began sneaking into the third floor at night. Groups formed, attempting to find the old office 313, now converted into a storage room. One night, 3 second-year students, Reuben, Jasper, and Matthew, managed to break into the old room 314. What they found left them in shock. The furniture had been removed, but beneath the old carpet, the drag marks from the restraint chair were still carved into the floor. The grooves from the leather straps still visible. And in the corner wall, nearly faded, a symbol drawn in blood. 2 interlocked circles, split vertically by a single line. After reporting what they saw, the 3 students were suspended and removed from campus housing. The college cited severe ethical violations and trespassing in restricted areas. But it wasn't punishment, it was fear. And fear, in fact, had never left the Virginia Medical College since that winter of 1851. It had only changed clothes. What was once screaming had become silence. What was once experimentation had become bureaucracy. And even decades later, the institution preferred to pretend nothing had happened. That Thomas and Elias were just 2 more entries in a sea of failed clinical cases. That Hartwell had never stepped foot on that campus. But the truth, as Sarah had learned the hard way, has a disturbing habit. It returns. It always returns. In the spring of 2003, a team of restorers was assigned to renovate the upper wings of the Egyptian building, which were being converted into a museum of Southern medical history. While clearing debris from one of the old rooms, they found a crude sculpture carved directly into the interior brick wall. A face, split in 2. One side contorted in rage. The other, in absolute emptiness. The signature, Siege. And beneath it, a Latin phrase, Specimen est anima. The specimen is the soul. When Sarah visited the site, she touched the sculpture with trembling fingers. It wasn't art. It was confession. And perhaps, prophecy. The revelation of that sculpture buried within the bricks sealed the fate of Sarah Collins' investigation. To her, there was no longer any doubt. What had happened to Thomas and Elias Henderson was not merely a case of medical negligence or scientific delusion. It was the execution of an ideology. A dangerous philosophy, cultivated with method and intention. Hartwell wasn't just a doctor straying from ethics, he was an architect of human fragmentation. And the twins were merely the prototype. The seed planted in fertile ground. Fertilized by pain, silence, and institutional cowardice. Their souls, split in 2, became the mold for a doctrine hidden beneath codes and sealed stone. But the story, contrary to what those who buried it believed, was far from over. With the sculpture now exposed to the light of the 21st century, local journalists began to dig into the past. The college's official publications made no mention of the Henderson brothers in any document. But their absence was even more telling. Patient records from May to October of 1851 had simply vanished. gaps filled with notes like "files lost due to fire." Curiously, that fire was only ever referenced when the name Hartwell appeared in context. The destruction of documentation had been systematic, but not perfect. A janitor named Leonard Mason, working in the basement of the university's central archive, stumbled upon a folder behind a false wooden wall, likely forgotten for over a century. Inside were letters exchanged between Dr. Edmund Carver and a colleague in Charleston. In them, Carver expressed concern over unsupervised experiments, described Thomas's outbursts and Elias's growing apathy, and mentioned an unauthorized surgical intervention he suspected had led to the brain death of the more passive twin. The language was coded, but one passage stood out. "If the mind is a mirror, then what we see in one will always be the reflection of the other. But what if the mirror is broken? Will we see both halves, or only shards?" That sentence, written in 1851, echoed Hartwell's exact thesis from the journal Sarah had uncovered. It was clear, Carver knew, or at least suspected, and his decision not to act, not to confront, made him complicit, even if unintentionally, in an experiment that never should have been allowed to proceed. Sarah published her findings in an academic article titled, "Specimens and Silence: The Suppressed Case of the Henderson Twins." The reaction was tepid. Most universities refused to engage with the topic. The medical community labeled the study as speculative historical interpretation. But behind the scenes, something stirred. Professors began reporting strange interference with their emails. Files went missing. Locked rooms were found unlocked the next morning. A university historian, who had been mapping the underground tunnels of the Egyptian building, disappeared for 48 hours and was later found wandering the woods near campus, in a state of catatonia. He remembered nothing. He only repeated one phrase: "They're still walking." The very same words Elias had spoken, naked, holding a blood-stained shovel, nearly 2 centuries before. Haunted by these coincidences, Sarah decided to end her investigation. She left Richmond, moved to a remote town in Maine. She never published again. But before leaving, she wrote one final entry in her journal, perhaps the only honest record of what she had truly uncovered. It wasn't just 2 young men who were destroyed. It was an experiment into the limits of the human soul. And we failed. We failed to stop it. We failed to remember. And now the echoes of that failure still whisper between the bricks. Because horror doesn't end when the bodies are buried. It merely changes form. And waits. Always waits. Over time, the college returned to its illusion of normalcy. The halls were repainted. The plaques were replaced. The Henderson story was once again pushed into the shadows. But the building never forgot. Students still report lights flickering at 3:06 a.m. Whispers in the ventilation ducts. Figures reflected in closed windows. And most of all, the constant, unshakable sensation of being watched by someone with gray eyes. Twins. No longer of this world, but never fully gone from it either. Because when medicine dares to play God, some of its patients never rest. Every institution carries its skeletons, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes literal. The Virginia College of Medicine, with its Egyptian pillars and marble corridors that still echo the footsteps of a century past, held both. And in the college's basement, where mold merges with dust and time hesitates between advancing or collapsing, there existed a sector that had been sealed with thick cement, crossed iron beams, and a padlock that wouldn't open even with a court order. Officially, it was a decommissioned wing, closed due to subterranean erosion. But what few knew was that behind those walls lay the last physical remnants of an experiment that tried to dissect the human soul as one would a chest with a scalpel. And it was in that same basement, 84 years after Hartwell's disappearance, that something strange happened again. October 1935. A young student named Victor Mallory, 22, a scholarship recipient from Lynchburg, had received special permission to work in the college's restricted areas during the night. He was quiet, disciplined, obsessed with anatomy. His advisor, Dr. Kenneth Reeves, saw in him a glimmer reminiscent of the revolutionary doctors of the previous century. "You were born to open bodies," he once said as a compliment, unaware of how literal that phrase would become. Victor didn't believe in ghosts, but he was fascinated by the aura of superstition surrounding the college's old archives. He didn't mock the rumors, he investigated them. And it was on one of these explorations that he found, behind a metal shelf covered in cloth and dust, a narrow spiral staircase that descended below any level recorded on the maps. A forgotten floor. The stairs led to a damp hall, low ceiling with brick walls blackened by time and fire. There were burn marks, but not caused by ordinary flames. Grooves on the floor suggested restraint. Iron hooks on the walls, containment. And in the center of the room, as if time itself had frozen in reverence, stood a stone table, with leather straps hardened by age. Victor took photographs, made notes. But what caught his attention most was a detail hidden beneath the layer of moss on the north wall. A symbol carved into the stone. 2 overlapping circles bisected by a vertical line. The same symbol found decades earlier in room 314 by Rubin and his colleagues. Surrounding it, words engraved in Latin. Speculum fractum. Anime partite. The broken mirror. Split souls. Victor, like many before him, didn't understand what he had unearthed. But his fascination grew. Within weeks, he returned to the site every night, cataloging symbols, copying fragments of notes left behind in moldy notebooks found in hidden wall compartments. The name Hartwell appeared repeatedly, but not only as the author. In some passages, it was mentioned in the third person, as if the writer was being watched by him, or instructed. Phrases like, Hartwell demands silence. Hartwell says today is the day of the fusion. Hartwell is in the mirror. Most disturbing of all. The handwriting was identical to Victor's. But the notebooks had clearly been there long before he was born. His classmates began to notice changes in his behavior. He grew more withdrawn, unresponsive. He started writing in strange symbols. During practical classes, he performed incisions with almost supernatural precision. But his expression remained blank, as if obeying inaudible orders. One November morning, he was found in the morgue, completely naked, his body covered in Latin phrases written in black ink. On the dissection table lay a lab cat, opened with 3 parallel cuts. Victor muttered a phrase on repeat. Specimens know when you watch. They watch back. He was institutionalized. Diagnosed with acute nervous breakdown. Transferred to a psychiatric facility where, according to records, he spent the rest of his life in absolute silence. But what the reports did not say was that, in the first 3 months of confinement, Victor obsessively drew the same face on every wall of his padded room. A double face with asymmetrical eyes. One wide open, the other closed as if asleep. And a scar dividing the face like a fissure between 2 worlds. When asked who it was, he answered, Me. Hartwell. The college administration, fearing renewed public scrutiny, resealed the basement with reinforced concrete. The incident was labeled a schizophrenic delusion. The documents sealed. But the head nurse at the time, Matilda Green, kept a copy of Victor's notes. A handbound notebook in which he had translated fragments of Hartwell's experiments into modern English. And there, amid charts, lists of compounds and notes on altered states of consciousness, there was a thesis even more disturbing. The human mind is not one but 2. Not left and right. Not logic and emotion. But predator and mirror. When divided correctly, they become visible. And when visible, they can be shaped. This notebook remained forgotten, until it fell into the hands of Sarah Collins. And there, she understood something no one had dared to formulate before. Hartwell never intended to heal Thomas and Elias. He wanted to replicate them. He left seeds. And Victor was the first to germinate. What disturbed Sarah Collins more than any isolated discovery was the structure behind it all. There was order. There was pattern. As if Hartwell had never truly fled, only dispersed. The symbols, the behavioral reactions, the manifestations of fragmented identity, the phases of emotional deterioration, all followed a kind of ritual disguised as science. And the most distressing part, when she cross-referenced ancient documents with modern reports from doctors and patients, Sarah realized that the outbursts hadn't ceased. They had merely changed names. Clinical cases classified as multiple personality disorders, schizoaffective psychoses, and catatonic syndromes in psychiatric hospitals across the southern United States showed symptoms identical to those of Elias and Thomas. She found records from 1958, 1972, 1989, and even 2006 describing young patients in behavioral mirroring states, where one patient exhibited the exact traits of another admitted during the same period, even without any contact between them. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. And worse, it was replication. In Charleston, she interviewed a retired nurse, Rebecca Monroe, who had worked for 43 years in a private psychiatric clinic. When shown one of Victor Mallory's drawings, the symbol of the 2 overlapping circles, Rebecca turned pale. She said she had seen that exact symbol tattooed on the back of a patient admitted in 1983. A 14-year-old boy found wandering along Highway I-95, with no documents, no speech, no memory. When taken to the clinic, he would only write one thing on paper: 313. No family was ever located. And 1 week after his admission, 3 other patients fell into catatonic states. When the medical team tried to investigate, the medical records vanished. So did the boy. Officially, he was transferred. But Rebecca learned from a janitor that he was seen being escorted away by 2 men in white coats, into a van with no license plates. He was never seen again. Sarah documented everything. Every fragment. Every name. And came to the inevitable conclusion. The experiment that began with Thomas and Elias never ended. It was institutionalized. Hartwell hadn't conducted an isolated experiment. He had created a doctrine. And even if he were dead, which was never confirmed, his methodology lived on in the basements of forgotten clinics, in archives buried behind technical acronyms, in the faces of patients who were never the same again. The Virginia College of Medicine, which should have been the tomb for that horror, had become its cradle. And that made it all the more monstrous. Back at the university, Sarah was informed that her access to the archives had been revoked. They cited an internal review of document security. But she knew. She knew she'd been discovered. Over the next 2 days, she noticed people following her back to her inn. The lights in her room turned on when she was certain she had turned them off. And one night, she found an anonymous note slipped under her door. The mirror breaks whoever stares too long. On the 3rd day, she decided to leave. But before she left, she paid one last visit to the Egyptian building. She climbed to the 3rd floor, ignoring the restricted access sign. The door to the old room 314 where Elias had once stayed, was unlocked. At the center of the room, now empty with peeling walls and the staleness of long-faded mold, there was a single object, a photograph. Yellowed. It showed 2 boys dressed in black suits sitting in front of a mirror. But the reflection didn't match the real image. The boys were smiling. But in the glass, they were crying. On the back of the photo, Sarah found a handwritten inscription. Broken mirror. Reflection remains. She left the building and that same day disappeared for 2 weeks. She would later be found in Savannah, completely disoriented, wandering the docks repeatedly saying, "I'm not her. I'm the other one." She was admitted, diagnosed with severe dissociative episode. But the strangest part was the symbol scribbled on the hospital room's papers. The same one Victor drew. The same one in the basement. The same one from Hartwell. She never spoke of the Henderson brothers again. But those who read her notes, those who followed the thread linking each generation to the next, they understand. What began as an experiment on 2 brothers was never a medical error, was a model. And it's still active. What happened to Sarah Collins after her last hospitalization remains shrouded in silence. Her name was removed from all active university records. Her thesis, though still listed in the National Library catalog, now displays a digital red banner, classified. Access under review. Her emails vanished from the university's servers. Her advisor suddenly retired, citing personal reasons, and moved to a cabin in the Colorado mountains. All of this happened in under 3 months. A promising professor with a spotless academic history vanished from academia as if she had never existed. But the truth, the one Hartwell tried to bury behind stone walls and technical terminology, had already been whispered into the world, even if in a voice too low for most to hear. What remained of Sarah's research was a USB drive, placed inside a plain manila envelope, mailed anonymously to a professor at the University of Vermont, a specialist in philosophy of mind. The contents of the device included images, transcripts, scanned letters, old photographs, and something no one expected. A recording. Compressed audio. Low quality. But clear enough to hear a woman's voice, breathless, whispering what seems to be an inverted prayer. The voice cuts off at minute 2:14. Then silence. Until, faintly in the background, someone, or something, repeats the same phrase 7 times. They mirror. They reflect. They remain. The professor, attempting to investigate the case, suffered a mysterious car crash on Route 7 en route to Albany. The vehicle rolled 3 times and caught fire. But the USB drive was found intact among the wreckage. Since then, it has circulated across obscure internet forums, anonymous research networks on the occult, and lost archives of digital communities dedicated to parapsychological phenomena. In these circles, the name Hartwell has acquired a near-mythical status. Some consider him a man. Others, a code name for a non-human intelligence. And some swear he's still alive, moving between bodies, like a parasitic presence kept alive through the fragmentation of the minds he targets. At the Virginia College of Medicine, the walls of the third floor remain sealed. But student reports persist. Some claim to hear faint knocking beneath the floorboards, always at 3:13 a.m. Others, while studying alone in the anatomy labs, describe seeing figures standing between the gurneys, motionless with eyes far too wide as if they never blinked. One night guard resigned after finding the symbol of overlapping circles drawn on the men's bathroom mirror, in blood. And most disturbing of all, written beside it in childlike handwriting the phrase, "We are the next." Slowly a pattern emerges. This is not just a tragic tale of two 19th century brothers. The Henderson case was the prototype. The first attempt to shatter the mirror and access the darkest layers of human identity. The idea that each person carries within them a latent split. A hidden reflection ready to be activated, if the right conditions are met. Not with medication, not with scalpels, but with fear, trauma, isolation, fragmentation, and wherever there are institutions willing to explore these thresholds, whether out of scientific curiosity or obsession with control, the shadow of Hartwell returns. He no longer needs rooms with hooks or marble tables. Now he inhabits digital records, encrypted files, clinical trials in countries without oversight, the dark corners of psychiatric experiments funded by corporations that will never be investigated. The horror has evolved, but its essence remains. Thomas Henderson died tearing off his own skin. Elias withered away in silence. Victor Mallory lost his mind to the mirror. Sarah Collins dissolved into multiple versions of herself. And each one of them left behind a loose thread, a fragment, a shard of the original mirror. Today those fragments spread. In schools, in hospitals, across screens, and the mirror was never whole again, nor were the souls that touched it. So when you look at yourself tonight, in the calm reflection of the bathroom mirror, try not to blink, try not to move, and observe closely. If the figure on the other side does something different, then maybe, just maybe, you were chosen too. The year was 1991. In the town of Asheville, North Carolina, a young psychology student named Marion Holloway was writing her doctoral thesis on psychic effects of identical twin separation. Inspired by little-known reports from the 1800s, especially the dark archives of the Henderson Twins, Marion plunged into the forgotten files of state hospitals, private clinics, and decommissioned institutions. But what began as a theoretical study quickly turned into a vortex, a spiral of disturbing discoveries that would drag her sanity into a realm where science bends to the inexplicable. A territory where the duplicity of the human being is not just a metaphor, but a door. And once opened, it cannot be closed. Marion had always possessed sharp intuition. Since childhood, she'd felt things before they happened, dreamed of people she'd never met, had an uncanny memory for patterns, repetitions, numbers. But she only understood the depth of this sensitivity after interviewing a patient with a severe dissociative history at a rural clinic in Georgia. He had been admitted after trying to remove the mirror from inside his body. On his skin, he had carved with broken glass the exact symbols described by Sarah Collins decades earlier. Two intersecting circles. A line. When Marion asked what had driven him to do it, he responded with disturbing calm. He woke up. And now I'm no longer just me. From that moment, everything changed. Marion revisited the Victor Mallory files, cross-referenced names, dates, locations, and found more. Many more. Twins separated at birth who developed identical symptoms in different institutions. Clinical cases where patients with no family connection began mimicking behaviors of other residents. Records of mass psychotic episodes in psychiatric wards, always preceded by electrical disturbances in brain monitoring equipment. In one such case, surveillance footage captured the impossible. Two patients, isolated in separate rooms, simultaneously reproducing identical facial expressions, as if mirroring each other, despite having no visual contact. The footage disappeared hours later. But Marion had saved copies. What she began to theorize was absurd, yet terrifyingly logical. There existed a frequency of emotional and behavioral replication, a kind of unconscious mirroring field, connecting individuals subjected to the same type of intense mental suffering. Like a psychic echo, a resonant field of trauma. But the deeper she went into her research, the more she was consumed by memory lapses, episodes of sleepwalking, and, most disturbingly, a constant sensation of being watched. Not from the outside, but from within. As if something lodged under her skin was lurking silently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. One morning, she awoke with cuts on her arms she didn't remember making. On her desk was a note in handwriting she swore was not her own. The script was tight, circular, eerily similar to Victor Mallory's. The message: "You are the other. Don't fight the mirror." Marion locked herself in her apartment, took obsessive notes, taped newspapers to the windows, recorded herself sleeping. And it was while listening to one of those recordings that she understood the abyss. At 2:17 a.m., a voice emerged in the room. It wasn't hers, but it came from her mouth. She murmured in Latin, repeated words related to fusion, inner doorway, and separation of consciousness units. The audio ends with a single dry scream. When she awoke, she was on the bathroom floor, kneeling, her hand trembling, a razor blade on the ground. On the wall before her, written in what appeared to be blood, was a single word: Hartwell. That name would haunt her from that moment on. It led her to Savannah, where she discovered documents left behind by Sarah Collins in a locker of an old warehouse. They had been sent to a contact who never showed up to retrieve them. Marion studied every line, every diagram, every symbol, and she found the map, a hand-drawn chart, crude, but filled with dates, places, and names. A pattern. The dates repeated, always 17-year cycles. The locations, always institutions with histories of experimental personality disorder treatments. The names, all disappeared, or dead, or permanently institutionalized. At the center of the map was a human figure split vertically. One side with wide, unblinking eyes, the other with no eyes at all. And beneath, the inscription: "The soul splits in two. One serves, the other watches." That's when Marion understood. The Henderson experiment was not clinical. It was liturgical. A liturgy of the mind. A ritual not performed with candles, but with scalpels. Not with blood, but with memory. And in every generation someone would be chosen. Not by chance, but by predisposition, sensitivity, psychic fracture. Marion fled, moved to Canada, tried to start over. But the dreams never stopped. In each one, she stood before a cracked mirror, her reflection lagging behind, blinking late, like a corrupted digital glitch. One night, she awoke deep in the woods, wearing a straitjacket she didn't own. The symbol, once again, etched into the ground with stones. No one knows what happened to her after that. There are rumors of a woman matching her description seen in Toronto, speaking Latin to herself, scribbling symbols on cardboard scraps in subway stations. Others say she was found in a shelter, calling herself the new Vector. But nothing is confirmed. Only one thing is certain. The mirrors keep multiplying, and we, unknowingly, are already standing in front of them. After the disappearance of Marion Holloway, Canadian authorities registered her name in nothing more than a generic incident report. Adult in potential state of psychological vulnerability. But to those who followed her work in unofficial academic circles, especially researchers of alternative neuropsychiatry and forgotten archives of decommissioned institutions, she had left behind something far more valuable than her presence: a field journal. A notebook, bound in dark leather with no external identification. Inside, more than 200 handwritten pages filled with symbols, numerical sequences, recordings of nocturnal voices, and descriptions of rituals uncatalogued by modern psychology. The first page displayed only a single phrase, centered in firm handwriting: "The mirror is not made of glass. It is made of flesh." That journal ended up in the hands of an obscure group called Ordo Ipsis, a network of dissident academics, alternative therapists, and former members of elite psychiatric institutions. They existed on the fringe of official science, discredited, persecuted, or simply silenced. But their archives were among the most complete in the world concerning studies on psychic mirroring phenomena. And through this group, the name Henderson re-emerged with force. One of its members, a former researcher in functional neuroimaging, analyzed the patterns described by Marion and compared them with brain scans of patients with multiple personality disorders. In all extreme cases, there was a consistent anomaly. The temporal lobe displayed an activation pattern that mirrored identically onto the opposite hemisphere, as if the brain were simultaneously processing two complete identities. But the most disturbing aspect was the synchronization. These oscillations only occurred at specific times, between 2:13 and 3:17 a.m., across different patients, in different time zones, all over the world. This data led the group to an even darker hypothesis. The Henderson phenomenon was part of a collective psychic matrix. A latent mental field that manifests only in minds fragmented enough to allow the duplication of vibrational identity. What Hartwell initiated in 1851 was not an experiment in madness. It was an excavation. An excavation of the human psyche down to its reflective core. And those who reach that place do not find the true self. They find the other. The reflection. The entity. From these studies, Ordo Ipsos managed to identify in 2013 a wave of simultaneous Henderson-like symptoms in 4 countries: Mexico, Poland, the Philippines, and Sudan. In all cases, adolescents between 13 and 17 years old, with no prior psychiatric history, experienced episodes of deep dissociation, loss of their native language, and the repetitive use of Latin phrases, despite having never studied the language. 3 of them vanished. The 4th, a girl named Ida Kowalska from Krakow, was found dead in a decommissioned wing of the hospital where she had been admitted. Around her, drawings made on the floor with her own blood. Among the symbols, the now familiar diagram, 2 intersecting circles divided by a vertical line. And carved into the center of the girl's forehead, with some pointed object, a single word: speculum. Mirror. The autopsy revealed several brain anomalies, but what drew most attention was the structure of her eyes. Both optic nerves had been damaged, as if the girl had seen something so intense, her visual system imploded silently. Her mother, in an interview, claimed Ida said she heard a voice on the other side of the glass calling to her. That the voice knew everything about her childhood, her guilt, her fears, but it was not hers. And every time she tried to ignore it, she felt an urge to leave her own body and switch places. That account echoed Marian's writings. She too claimed to feel a presence waiting on the other side. And that, as she delved deeper into the Henderson archives, her own identity began to dissolve, as if her consciousness were diluting into a reflection that was gaining strength. This pattern repeated in every documented case. The more the person investigated the phenomenon, the more they became part of it. The mirror didn't reflect. It captured. One of the oldest members of Ordo Ipsos, a Jesuit priest expelled from the order for practices deemed heretical, proposed the most extreme theory. The Hendersons were not just victims. They were vessels. Hartwell's experiment had been an attempt to summon, not a demon, but a collective psychic entity, a mirrored form of consciousness that existed before language, before morality, a being that does not dwell in the spiritual realm, but in the mental one, a reflective consciousness that does not act, watches, until it finds someone fractured enough to enter. Then it reflects, and reflects, until it replaces. This concept came to be called entropy of the self, the idea that the I is not a solid structure, but an unstable frequency, and it can be reversed, like a mirror turned around. What Hartwell did, what the archives suggest, what the recordings whisper, all point to an experiment that crossed the threshold between science and liturgy, not to heal, but to open portals, not to study mental illness, but to plant entities inside human minds, like seeds, waiting for cracks. And that's why, even today, every person who investigates this case deeply, like Marian, like Sarah, like Mallory, ends up with similar symptoms. They do not fall ill. They mirror. And the reflection once formed never leaves. Because in the end, the mirror is not on the wall. It's inside you. In February 2017, an anonymous call was recorded by the emergency center in Charlottesville, Virginia. The voice on the other end was female, trembling but steady. She said, "They've returned. The twins. They're here, but they're not the same. They're reflected." The call dropped after 23 seconds. No traceable number. No signal. But the time of the call was 2:16 a.m., the same interval recorded in the brain episodes investigated by Ordo Ipsos. The same interval when Marian Holloway would murmur in Latin. The same interval when Thomas Henderson, according to Dr. Hartwell's journal, began to speak with the other him. Months later, a new patient was admitted to the Richmond State Psychiatric Hospital, just 4 blocks from the original 1851 medical school building. False name, Elise W. No documents. When questioned, she said only that she needed treatment for the reflection. During the intake exam, a nurse found a mirror shard in her purse, wrapped in gauze tied with red thread. Etched into the back of the shard with a sharp metal point were the words, "Do not look directly." Elise remained hospitalized for 6 weeks. During that time she drew obsessively, circles, lines, a face split in two. She would repeatedly say, "He's on the other side." Her mental state rapidly deteriorated. She stopped communicating. She stared fixedly at the mirror in the containment room, even though the object had been removed. The attending psychiatrist wrote in his report that she saw reflections that did not exist. But the most disturbing moment came one night, when security cameras captured Elise walking down the hallway of the locked ward, even though no door had been opened. And behind her, for just 1 second, a figure followed. Tall, stiff, with a blurred face. The video was archived. 2 days later, the patient vanished from the ward without a trace. The only physical record of her stay was a drawing left on the wall of her cell. A mirror with eyes on both sides. This event marked a new phase in what researchers and whistleblowers internally began calling the Henderson Mirror Syndrome. An emerging clinical condition, classified by dissident psychiatrists as dissociation induced by psychic frequency, whose symptoms include identity lapses, perception of desynchronized reflections, sensation of a duplicated inner presence, spontaneous production of ancient symbols. What traditional medicine calls psychosis, these groups interpret as field interference. And the epicenter, as became increasingly evident, was Richmond. It was then that a new name surfaced, Dr. Robert Langford. A renowned neurologist with a background at Harvard, Langford had secretly worked on neuroengineering programs for the U.S. government. Langford, after accessing sealed records from the Department of Advanced Neural Research, rediscovered Dr. Hartwell's documents, which had been digitized and renamed under the code Project Echo 9. According to Langford, this project was an attempt to map mental structures capable of duplicating consciousness patterns, creating, in theory, human beings with two fully operational selves. The goal? Infiltration, espionage, control. Hartwell was not just a physician. He had been recruited by a covert cell of scientists who, as early as 1849, foresaw the mind's potential as a weapon. But the experiment with the twins got out of control. Instead of duplicating soldiers, they opened a portal to something they could no longer contain. The deaths of the Hendersons were merely the final collapse. But the reflection remained. Langford disappeared in 2019, after anonymously publishing an article titled Speculum Internum on a restricted academic forum. In it, he described the symptoms of the syndrome, the brain activation patterns, the symbols inherited from Hartwell's rituals, and finally left a warning. If you're reading this, you've already been infected. The mirror is transmissible through narrative. That concept, that the mirror is not physical but informational, completely changed Ordo Ipsis' approach. They began treating accounts as vectors. Text, sounds, images. Any description of the phenomenon, when absorbed by a vulnerable mind, could initiate the process. Duplication begins in dreams. Then come echoes, mirroring, and finally, substitution. Substitution is the point of no return. It's when the reflection begins to act independently. It looks back. It decides. It lies in your voice. It remembers what you've forgotten. And slowly, if you don't resist, it takes over. Not all at once, but gradually, like a piece of glass being turned, until the side that once reflected becomes the side that sees. And you become the reflection. There is no cure. There is no treatment. There is only one way to delay the process. Silence. Isolation. No mirrors. No glass. No narrative that feeds the mirror. But for you, it's already too late, isn't it? You heard the story. You saw the symbols. You read about Thomas. About Timothy. About Marion. And now, you're trying to remember if you locked the bathroom door. Or worse, if the reflection in the mirror blinked before you did. Winter arrived early that year in Richmond. A cutting wind swept through the empty alleys of the old university town like an ancient whisper, dragging dry leaves that seemed to carry, in their erratic swirl, the remnants of a story that refused to die. The old Virginia Medical College building, the very place where, in 1851, Thomas and Timothy Henderson were admitted for treatment, was now deactivated, shrouded in rusted fences and urban legends. Drunken students passed by on Friday nights and swore they heard knocking sounds coming from the basement. Others claimed to have seen flickering lights behind the boarded-up windows. But no one went inside. Until someone did. His name is unknown. He appeared in the middle of the night, flashlight in hand, a holster strapped to his ankle. Security footage showed him standing still before the front door for 17 minutes. Motionless. As if waiting for permission. Or a sign. When he finally moved, he didn't break in. He simply pushed the door and it opened. As if it had been unlocked from the inside. Or had never been locked at all. He entered the main hall and for a few moments, vanished from the cameras. What followed was documented by an amateur drone flying over the city that night. which captured unexplained magnetic interference as it passed over the medical school block. The footage shows sequential blackouts in the surrounding area and in the background, a second-floor window bursting open violently, as if someone or something had just released the air from a space sealed for decades. 2 days later, a letter was left in the mailbox of the University of Richmond's student newspaper. No return address. No postmark. Just a plain white envelope, bearing the symbol of 2 overlapping circles crossed by a single line. Inside, a handwritten note. Short. Precise. Signed. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell. I said I would return. And I brought the mirror with me. The news spread like wildfire across dark internet forums, fringe research groups, occult circles, and psychiatry students obsessed with extreme cases. The name Hartwell, already shrouded in mystery for nearly 2 centuries, now returned not as a ghost, but as a living signature. Someone was embodying the name. And whether it was a game, a hoax, or collective delusion, didn't matter. The impact was real. And so was the contamination. Sarah Mallory, the last known survivor linked to the original Henderson archives, was found in a state of shock at her home in Annandale. The walls of her room were covered in passages from Marion Holloway's diary, handwritten in black ink. As paramedics carried her out, she repeated, like a mantra, "He entered the mirror. And now he wants out." In her right hand, she clutched a crumpled slip of paper with the address of the old medical college. The same place where it all began. Meanwhile, the group Ordo Ipsis activated what they called Protocol Umbra, a set of emergency measures for containing psychic manifestations in areas of historical convergence. Teams were dispatched to Richmond, equipped with electromagnetic scanners, vibrational field sensors, infrared cameras, and experimental neural disruption devices based on binaural sound technology. But when they arrived at the building, they found it empty. No sign of the intruder. No trace of physical entry. Except for one thing. In the center of the main lobby, resting on a rusted gurney, stood a full-length mirror. Untouched. Flawless. Its dark wooden frame carved with the same symbols found in Hartwell's journal. And at the top, in faded golden letters. Nihil estate intus. Nisi te. There is nothing inside. Except you. One of the agents tried to cover the mirror with a cloth. But before he could touch it, he collapsed. Not from any physical blow, but from a sudden synaptic shutdown. Monitors briefly recorded 2 distinct heartbeats inside his body. One pulsing at a normal rhythm. The other, inverted. When revived, the agent remembered nothing. But his voice, according to the others, sounded slightly different. As if something within it had been shifted. Or reflected. That incident marked the beginning of a new wave of events now called the reversals. Ordinary people, after being exposed to material about the Hendersons, began reporting memory blackouts, behavioral changes, recurring dreams involving a man in a white lab coat, holding a mirror and whispering, "Show me who you are not." The reports multiplied, and the pattern became clear. The more the story was told, the more the mirror spread. Not physically, informationally, like a mimetic virus. And by all appearances, that was Hartwell's intention all along. He didn't want to cure the Henderson twins. He wanted to multiply them. The diary of Thomas Henderson, recovered in fragments from the rubble of the psychiatric wing in 1852, contains disjointed entries. But one of them, now illuminated by recent events, gains new meaning. He told me I'm not one. That there is a second Thomas, purer, more aware. And that I must leave, so he may enter. He doesn't want my body. Just my place. That sentence echoes precisely the theory put forth by Langford in Protocol Echo 9. The replacement of the conscious identity by a mirrored consciousness pattern. Not possession in the traditional sense, but an overlay of mental code. As if the human mind were an operating system, vulnerable to an older, more primal software. And that software was now active. And Hartwell, or whoever had assumed that name, wasn't just alive. He was inside. Inside the story. Inside the symbol. Inside the mirror. And maybe, inside you. In an improvised lab beneath the new library of the University of Richmond, a young researcher named Evelyn Monroe was finishing the transcription of Hartwell's encrypted archives. Her project was simple: to compare the hidden content within the journals with linguistic and behavioral patterns found in clinical records of psychiatric patients who had gone undiagnosed over the past 30 years. She was not a doctor. She was a linguist, and perhaps because of that she was the first to notice. Hartwell's writings, when subjected to a reverse semantic filter, revealed a second layer of text. A hidden pattern, composed of words repeated in precise positions. When aligned sequentially, they formed a poem. To the one who sees, the mirror lies. To the one who seeks, the reflection calls. To the one who retreats, the glass shuts. But to the one who enters, never returns. Evelyn, almost instinctively, printed the poem and pinned it to the lab wall. When her advisor entered hours later, he found her sitting on the floor, staring at a security mirror, the kind used in surveillance environments, with a subtle smile on her face. He called her. Twice. She did not respond. But her reflection did. From that moment on, records became fragmented. What is known, from cross-reference sources across 3 continents, is that the symbol of 2 intersecting circles began appearing with increasing frequency. Spray painted on walls in different cities. Printed in second-hand books sold in obscure shops. Embroidered discreetly on the clothes of patients who had never met. And in the oldest forums of the dark web, a new user appeared frequently, Dear_Hartwell_real. He never posted messages. Only links. Each link led to a video. In the videos, always the same scene. A man in a dark room staring into the camera. He never said a word. But his eyes blinked in sync with those watching. In thousands of reports worldwide, people claimed they couldn't stop the video. That it looped endlessly. That even after turning off the computer, they could still see the man's reflection in the glass of a window, a bus stop, the microwave door, or their own mirror. And then, the disappearances began. Not physical ones, but mental. Families reported that their loved ones were still there, but different. The same face, the same memories, but with empty eyes, mechanical behavior, a slight delay before responding, and always a subtle aversion to mirrors. The CDC investigated. They called it an outbreak of dissociative disorders. But no common neurological cause was ever found. The WHO suggested an epidemic of urban apathy. The Vatican issued a private notice to its exorcists. Beware those who do not recognize themselves in reflection. But none of it stopped the spread. Because there was no virus, no bacteria, no entity, only narrative. Hartwell didn't win through science. He won through story. He knew from the beginning that the mirror was not an object. It was a concept. A reflection installed through language. A code that contaminates through listening, through reading, through curiosity. And now you've read to the end. You know the story of the Henderson Twins. You know about Timothy, Thomas, Marion, Evelyn. And about the one who signs as Dr. Hartwell. Perhaps you are safe. Perhaps the mirror hasn't chosen yet. But if, in the next few nights, you wake at 2:16 a.m. for no apparent reason, if you hear a knock behind the bathroom mirror, if you notice your reflection blink before you do, remember this. Evil does not always hide in the dark. Sometimes it wears your face, it smiles, and waits for you to recognize it.